Para BibloRed y la Escuela de Lectores es un gusto y un honor contar con la presencia de la doctora Maryanne Wolf, directora del Centro de Estudios para la Dislexia y la Justicia Social de la Universidad de California y la autoridad mundial más importante en el tema de la lectura y el cerebro. Justamente sobre eso tratará esta charla, que espero disfruten tanto como la disfrutamos nosotros. Recuerden seguirnos en www.biblored.gov.co/escuela.
Hello to everyone in Colombia and all those who are listening today. What a pleasure and privilege it is for me to speak to all of you who are part of the School of Readers. What a beautiful name, a perfect name for all of us who understand the beauty of the act of reading and what it can do to change the lives of individuals, to change the lives of a culture. And indeed, I will argue to change even how we grow as a species. So my talk will be about how in the world the brain ever learned to read and what the knowledge about that can help us as we move into a digital culture. So my talk actually comes out of a mission that I've had all of my academic life, and that is to understand that literacy is a basic human right. Now, Paulo Freire and Pope Francis today are united. What is so wonderful is to see how our, if you will, some of our highest leaders and best thinkers have told us that literacy is so important that it is a human right. And for all readers, for all learners, all who have no literacy, we are working for making a more literate world. And because of the pandemic, it's even more important for us to join efforts like yours in the School of Readers to ensure that we reach so many people and not only move from non-literacy to literacy, but from basic literacy to expert reading and thinking. And we're going to talk about how extraordinary it is that the brain can connect all of its parts to make not just a reading circuit, but to enable us to propel, to elevate, to inspire our own best thoughts. So I'm coming to you from Los Angeles. If you look behind you, you're seeing that I'm in my home with a painting by my son, who's a dyslexic artist. This isn't a talk about dyslexia, but if it were, I would say it is one of the most extraordinary brains, and what a pleasure and what a gift it was when I have received my son as a dyslexic artist, as you can see here. I'm a professor, for those of you who don't know, at the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice. And social justice is very much at the heart of putting science and education together to elevate the learning of all our citizenry, wherever they are. And this work is about connecting different kinds of knowledge bases. Neuroscience with education is what I do most, but I need you to know that I do that so that we can learn about how best to teach children wherever they are, in classrooms, in refugee camps, in places where it's too far to even think about having a school. We need to help in all of those settings, here in Latin America, in North America, in Africa, India, around our world. Now, my colleague from Paris, Stanislas Dehaene, said something that I like to begin with. Why neuroscience and education? Parents and educators and policymakers and medical professionals, everyone will have a better understanding of what reading changes in a brain if we study it, if we understand the circuit that the brain builds when it learns to read. So he said, I am convinced that increased knowledge of these circuits will greatly simplify the teacher's task and the parents' hopes. So let's begin with the reading circuit. It begins with a very unusual, simple sentence that began a book that I wrote years ago called Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain. And the sentence is an idea, a concept that I never realized until I started really studying reading. And it is that we weren't meant to read. It sounds so simple. But if we were not meant to read, how did we do it? And what does it mean not to be born to read? Well, the reality is the brain has design principles, and the design principles allow us to rearrange and make new connections among older parts that are already there. So in this slide, you see what the circuit is doing is pulling together, making new networks among vision, language, affect, emotional, and conceptual thinking, and the motor skills. All of that is coming together, but slowly through the life of the child's development. But there's a second principle that underlies the fact that we weren't meant to read the way we were meant to speak and to see and to have all these skills that we have. It means that when the brain creates something new, that new circuit is plastic. There's not one circuit. And just think about Spanish. How different the circuit would be for the Spanish, an alphabet, from a different writing system, let's say Chinese, or a syllabary in Japan, kana, or a local syllabary, kanji, in Japan, which is like Chinese. Each writing system requires slightly different emphases in different regions of the brain. So literally that Chinese reading brain is just a little different from the Spanish alphabet reading brain. It's just a way of showing you that the circuit is plastic and will reflect what's required of it. Now, that has to do with the writing system, but it also has to do with how a child is educated and whether it's educated to move from a very basic circuit to an embroidered, elaborated one. But there's a third principle under plasticity that we are involved in this moment of our species history. The circuit will be affected and influenced by the medium, how you read, whether you read in print or whether you read only on screens. Those changes in the medium are also reflected in the brain circuit. And there are important things that we will say about that towards the end of my talk. But how does the brain do it in the beginning? Well, that little baby is not reading, nor should you ever force a baby to read, which some parents unfortunately think is good. Not good. What the baby does is develop the parts of the circuit, the visual parts, the language parts. And so our job as a culture, as caretakers, as early child workers, and as parents, we really are the ones who are helping develop the parts, especially in language. What are the phonemes? That's a word for the smallest sounds in a language. How does the child learn later to read involves putting phonemes, what they know is a sound in their language, together with a visual symbol. Well, that requires that they have phonemes represented in their brain. So I especially want those of you who are having children who with bilingual or multilingual backgrounds, whatever that mother language is, make sure the phonemes and the words are known by that child. That's really important in the first 5 years. The first 5 years, we, the society, are helping the child learn that language. We do it through reading to them every night, to talking to them, to singing to them. I use the term talk, read, and sing because every single book that you read, and I hope parents, and I hope everyone listening to this knows that one of the best things you can do to increase reading is to read to your child yourself, especially in those first 5 years, so they know what books are. Every book has a story, has words that the children are learning, concepts that they are adding to their background knowledge, knowing how a book works. These are important aspects that help develop our children, not just linguistically, but social, emotionally. They are learning about life and about how we treat each other, how we treat others is so important in the stories that they get from us. But what happens when we don't do that? In the United States and in almost every country, there is a gap between the parents who are very privileged and are talking and having their children hear words over and over and over again. And it means that by the time that child is 5, they've heard millions of words in their brain and they are represented there. But what if a parent who doesn't know this doesn't speak that much to their child? There can be a huge gap of millions of words that children don't hear before 5. And it brings me to a concept that hurts. It's very painful because when you think of literacy as a basic human right, language is so important. Conceptual development is so important before we even begin to read. And like the Bible's Matthew, what they call the Matthew effect, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer if they don't have this knowledge. We do not want a gap that doesn't need to be there. We have enough gaps in our society. Let us work to be sure that all children and all parents know that between 0 and 5, the more we talk, the more we read to our child, the richer in language and background knowledge they will be. There's an aspect that I just mentioned, however, that I really want to emphasize, and that is these little books. I picked out Frog and Toad are friends. These little books teach us about friendship. They teach us about who others are, how others think, and how others think differently from us. This is the beginning, the origin of empathy. And in this moment in time, in our connected world, what we are seeing are more divisions among people than ever before. Let us teach our children to have empathy, to have perspectives for others. And each little story introduces a child to new information about others. That is a chance for them to try on what another person thinks. They leave their egocentrism behind. Wouldn't that be wonderful if all our children, all our human beings really understood from the beginning how important it is to have what the philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls a compassionate imagination. An understanding of who others are would be an amazing foundation for the future of a better world. Now, we have in the United States a group called Reach Out and Read from our pediatricians. And I'm hoping in Columbia that you either have something like that or that you can develop it. There are different ways of helping that 0 to 5 group, but pediatricians can do a great service, as they do in the Reach Out and Read, by simply giving a book to parents that's appropriate for that child at every well visit. And we do that with those pediatricians who are part of this organization. And parents are like mystified. They don't know, they don't realize that reading to a book to a child is important. They think, well, the child can't understand. That child is gaining so much more. From the time the child is 6 months old and could sit in your lap, under the crook of your arm, they are learning and they are associating love. But as a neuroscientist, there's something that's very important for you to know. My colleague John Hutton in Cincinnati studies those children who have a caretaker or a mother who reads every day to them, and then compares them to children who don't have that. And he did this with very impoverished neighborhoods, mothers who were not rich, mothers who were in fact very poor, but had knowledge about the fact that they should read to their child. What happened is that neuroimaging, looking at the child's brains of those who had been read to, showed us that there is more activation in the brain regions for language, in both understanding language and expressing language in children who are read to. He also found something quite interesting that I always want to tell parents. Don't make the iPad a babysitter. That's not how to give language. He actually compared how children look in their language regions in their brain when they either have the story with the parent, or listen to it in an audio version, or see it in an iPad, the same story. More language activation when it's interactive with the parent. The parent interacts. And that's a really important thing for all of us to know in this moment in our digital culture. Now, after the first 5 years, all those parts of the brain need to get connected. And that's us, the teachers. What we first do is really teach the child to pull together those phonemes, those sounds, with letters. That's called letter-sound correspondence rules. And that's essential. Methods that are called phonics are really very important. They give explicit, very systematic instruction in decoding. But never neglect books and vocabulary with just because you're teaching phonics. You need phonics and you need books, because the reading brain needs to be able to apply this to stories. So I tell all teachers, those teachers who only were doing books that was called whole language or balanced literacy, that's not good enough. It's good. Phonics is truly good, but it's not enough either. It's when you carefully, explicitly put it together that you have the foundation for a first reading brain circuit that we then develop into an elaborated reading circuit for deep reading. Now, what is deep reading? One of the beautiful parts about my work is that I get to read about what goes into reading. And it's so beautiful and complex. It begins with the fact that we need background knowledge. I need to go back to background knowledge. We need background knowledge. Oh, and my goodness, my friend, my colleague, who is one of your speakers, Alberto Manguel. No one does more beautiful books about reading than Alberto Manguel. But he always says that each reader is accumulating in a geometric progression what went before. So that background knowledge is very important. Another aspect which is so important is perspective taking. leaving that reading book behind and taking on the perspective of others. That's the development of empathy. And fiction, novels, oh my goodness, that inspires you to leave yourself, understand the consciousness and feelings of people you would never otherwise meet. What happens is that our brain becomes like a laboratory for empathy, for compassion for others. And our former president, Barack Obama, used to talk to the novelist, Marilynne Robinson, about what empathy does and how important it is. And she said something very important. She said, if you don't read, you're not understanding others. And the trend towards seeing those different as sinister other is the greatest danger to continuing our democracy. This is really important for you to understand. We in neuroscience can look at that brain and see empathy changes us. It gives us a theory of another's mind. And I liken this, if you will, all these parts of the brain that are developing to Sherlock Holmes. He's looking at all the details. He's making analogies between what he knows and what he sees, the mystery of text, if you will. It is inspiring for me to think about the reading brain as part Sherlock Holmes, but not just Sherlock Holmes. But what we do when we pull all this together, empathy and critical analysis, is that we are now able to discern what is true or not true in that text. This moment, more people believe falsehoods in what they read than ever before because they are misled to think that that silo of information that they always go to is just telling them the truth. They aren't using their full reading brain. They aren't using their critical analysis or their empathy to make a value judgment about what the text is really telling us. Now, I'm going to spend only a few seconds on this one. The reality is that most of us, when we read, aren't reading critically and empathically enough. But if we do, I want to tell you there is a great reward. When we give the time to that, we give ourselves at the very end just seconds, not even seconds, milliseconds, to connect to our best thoughts, our insights, our reflections. And that is a moment at the very end of the reading process that doesn't necessarily happen very often. But it's our contemplative function. It's at the end of reading. And I use here St. Thomas Aquinas because he was probably the best reader in the last 1,000 years. You know, who am I to suggest that he is the world's best reader? But I think he was. And so I use him to show this reading brain is connecting all of these extraordinary parts. But at the end of it, when you pull all this together into insight through this contemplative, reflective pause, you are given your own best thoughts. But deep reading isn't a given. It's not a given for children. They have to learn how to do that. That's part of our job as educators. It takes years to form. But there's something that's unfortunate that's happening right now that I didn't even want to know about. But the reality is that when we're on a different kind of medium, we don't necessarily give the time to critical analysis, empathy, and reflection. And that's what I want to help you understand in my last minutes together. I am telling you from this whole talk that literacy changes your brain, changes the children's brain, the adult's brain. It changes our society and ourselves as a species. And it's begun to change because the medium is being reflected in the circuit. Now, I want to say this is not a binary. Oh, no reading in print or no reading in digital. No, no, no. And it's not tradition versus future or innovative. None of that. My colleague Sherry Turkle said it best. We transgress, we make a mistake, not because we try to build the new, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what it disrupts or diminishes. That's part of my mission too. What does a different medium expand or diminish? And as my colleague Patricia Greenfield said, every medium has costs and weaknesses, but the digital medium costs seem to be deep processing. So think about yourselves. What's the new normal? It's skimming, word browsing, word spotting, F, Z. We are not concentrating or focusing in the same way when we're on a digital medium, which means we have less sustained attention, which means we don't remember as well either what we've read because we're reading so much. Now, the advantage, of course, is that we are bombarded with information. Oh, so much information. And the digital medium allows us to scan that information, to absorb a lot. But how much do we absorb? That's the problem. And all forms of new mediums seem to advantage speed of processing over reflective processing. And we have to really be able to say what medium is best for what purpose. If we do not, if we begin to just have a kind of a digital way of reading, skimming, scanning, we will be gradually diminishing deep reading. We will be, as unfortunately my former president did, everything in tweets. Complexity is not attainable within a limited amount of words and characters. We lose complexity with a Twitter brain. We fail to truly understand other. In the school of readers, you appreciate beauty. Language is part of the greatest gift of beauty to us. Every author tries their hardest to portray their best thoughts with their best words. That's not happening when we go. So our whole world is changing, and we're not ever going to go back. But we need to think about what would happen if critical analysis and empathy atrophy. Then we are more than likely going, because there's so much information, to our familiar silos of information. Left, right, progressive, conservative. And we think, oh, we know those silos, and we believe what's ever in them. We aren't critical because they're confirming. It's called confirmatory bias. This confirming what we thought before we ever began to read. That's not what is the best of reading, which is to be able to have empathy for another perspective to try it on. Without that critical analysis and empathy, we are threatening a democratic society. That's a big statement that I never thought I would ever make. But what we are doing in our culture is preparing for that, in a way, less thoughtful kind of society. Why? Look around. Look, every other baby in the United States is having an iPad, and that is not a caretaker. It is not a pacifier. If I could do anything, I would be very, very careful about anything but FaceTime and a little digital in the first 5 years, but not a lot. Not outlawed. If you outlaw it, then you make it the forbidden fruit. We don't want that. But we also don't want it as a reward or as something that's constantly causing the child to have this overstimulated brain. And then when they go off the screen, they say, you know what they say? They say, I'm bored. That's because they've been overstimulated. Dopamine lollipop, dopamine lollipop. we need to really think through how carefully and wonderfully we could use the digital world, because especially after COVID, we know it's essential, but it is essential to be done in very careful ways. My clinical psychologists are always talking about the changes in attention in our youth and how their attention is really different for those who are on the iPad. Well, their scores in PISA too are different. The ones who are online more have less high scores on PISA. Who would have thought? My e-read network in Europe is showing us, by taking all the studies for, oh my gosh, almost 20 years, that compare how do you comprehend when you read the same story on a screen or in a book. Over 171,000 participants. And what do you find out? You comprehend better as young adults with print. Now, the young adults themselves say, oh no, I do better on digital. And you ask, why? And they say, because we're faster. We're faster on the screen. The book slows us down. And I have to say, yes, it slows you down just enough so that you allocate more time to critical analysis and empathy. I'm not suggesting that we don't use the screen. I'm suggesting that we learn how to use both books and the screen in ways that don't take us to a point where, if you look at our adolescents in the United States, they are not reading books. They are so immersed in the digital world and games that the displacement of time is really changing in our children and youth's lives. And what will happen when they just believe that all they need to know is at the click of a finger? Now, that's an important thing. We want the expansion of knowledge, but we need knowledge that's internalized too, so that they will have the capacity to be able to say, oh, that's false news, that's fake news, that's false information. I know, and I can check. So digital literacy is really important. I'm going to, my last slides are going to be really about what do we do about all this? You who are the School of Readers, what do you do? And I suggest we do both. We preserve books and the role of books, especially in the first 10 years of life and later. And we expand by giving them all this opportunity for learning to program and code digitally. So in my last book, if you will, which was called Reader, Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, I spend some time describing what is my proposed brain for the future of our children, which is a biliterate one, in which children are learning on two paths, two parallel paths. One, they're learning and they receive books under the arm in the first 5 years. They're learning to use their deep reading skills with books and print largely, unless they are dyslexic, and then they are doing both books and having automatic practice with digital. There are wonderful things that digital can give us. So there are, if you will, expansion of cognitive skills that digital culture gives us. And we want that parallel track going on. So by the end of 10, 11, 12 years of age, the kids really can use their deep reading skills on any medium. And that will help us prevent their vulnerability, our citizens' vulnerability to false information, to false hopes by politicians, by false expectations by demagogues who say everything is that the others are doing makes your life worse. Well, how do we think when some of our leaders are saying such things? We have to have a critical analytic mind that's open to different perspectives, that can try on and say, this is correct and this is not. We have a duty, if you will, to read and read carefully and well. And books are really important in our lives. Now, Joseph Epstein said, this wonderful writer, a biography of any literary person ought to deal at length with what he or she read and when, for in some sense, we are what we read. I want to suggest to you, that's true. We are what we read. And if I were Alberto Manguel, I would love to study his brain. He is so full of what he has read. But I add, we are also how we read. And that's so important, that we preserve critical analysis and empathy as leading to that pause, that Proustian pause I call, which is the sum of our best thoughts. And that novelist, who is also one of my most favorite novelists, Marilynne Robinson, especially if those of you haven't read her trilogy on Gilead and Home and Lila, please read it. She said, if God has taken pleasure in his creation, some part of God's pleasure is in your best idea, your most disciplined thinking on whatever is true, honorable, just, pleasing, and worthy of praise. That's what reading can give us. And you and I, you in the school of readers, Diana, Carolina, Juan, all of you who are working so hard, you are the stewards. You who have turned into, listen to this, if you will, this plea by me to think about reading in a new way. You are the stewards of the next generation. And I'm closing with a philosopher, Martha Nussbaum. It would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. It is therefore urgent now to produce citizens who can see the different and foreign not as a threat, but as an invitation to expand their own minds and capacity for citizenship. This moment, and I use Marilynne Robinson to end this moment is our test, our charge. She said, the greatest test ever made of human wisdom and decency may very well come to this generation or the next. We must teach and learn broadly and seriously. I thank you, School of Readers, for inviting me. I thank you, everyone who has listened to this. It's wonderful, I believe, to be the first woman speaker in your series. But along with Alberto Manguel, my dear colleague, we invite you to become not just part of the School of Readers, but one of its teachers. Our young, all our young, are our charge. Thank you so much. And thank you again to Diana and to Carolina and Juan for doing this.
Para nosotros es un honor tenerte. Esperamos mucho tiempo, te leemos mucho y en la Escuela de Lectores estamos trabajando justamente por lo que tú has mencionado y es generar espacios para que Bogotá y obviamente Colombia sea una ciudad de lectores, de cuidadores y de seres cuidados.
So thank you, Dr. Wolf, so much for this wonderful presentation. For us in the School of Readers, it's an honor to have you. And as members of the city of Bogotá and the country of Colombia, we are very interested in promoting ways that include diversity and promote, dijiste promover,
la lectura en una ciudad cuidadora y de seres cuidados.
And to promote literacy in a city that takes care of people and also self-care of themselves. We take care of the citizens and citizens that can be able to take care of themselves.
Tenemos, doctora Wolf, 3 preguntas que hemos preparado desde la Escuela de Lectores y que pues queremos compartir con usted y a su vez compartir con todas las personas que van a escuchar y a disfrutar de su charla de manera pública, abierta y gratuita, como debe ser la educación y la lectura.
So, Dr. Wolf, we have prepared 3 questions that we would like to ask you. And this talk is very important for us because it's going to be a public talk available to everybody and free in the way that all culture activities should be for every citizen that is interested in acquiring knowledge. So question number 1 is, how can we build emotional connection with the complex act of reading for the people who don't have access to the written culture?
This is a very, very important and difficult question. And I have worked in Australia with Indigenous people there. And we have really done 2 things that I think are important. One is to respect the oral cultures of people who do not come from a literate culture, and to connect the beauty of their oral culture by, in many cases, making little books out of the stories, the history that they have carried on in an oral fashion. Remember, Socrates didn't want us to read. He wanted us to have an oral culture because he believed that words are life. He even used the term living words. Well, by respecting the living words and the oral culture of those who come from a non-literate culture, and using stories as a bridge into saying we can capture for all future generations the oral culture, we are doing something very special. So in both in Australia and especially in some South African cultures, there's been a real attempt to build storybooks based on the non-literate culture of that group of people. And so as a bridge, I would suggest to you that would be a wonderful way of showing respect and continuation, that this is a way of continuing. And this is a really important aspect of emotional development, because emotions are not just what we give to a non-literate culture, but what we receive. And so we want to understand what is the way that social and emotional development was taught in another culture. So we ourselves have to leave our own, if you will, egocentrism to help understand how social emotional growth has been given all over time in another culture. And so we have much to learn too. It's a reciprocal. But I think one of the most important things is to begin with the respect for the non-literate culture's traditions, and to help continue them in a way that preserves them and yet expands them and gives them, if you will, a legacy over time. So it's a delicate, complex question, but it's a beautiful one.
And it's a wonderful answer. Such a beauty to think about legacy.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. Question number 2, considering this technological and digital era, we have known that Marvel uses a transmedia narrative strategy that implies books, comics, movies, TV series, and so on and so on. So we would like to ask you, are there any studies of the long-term effect on the children and adolescents' brain that have been exposed continually to these kind of narratives?
It's an interesting question. And of all things, my neighbor works for Marvel. It's so funny that you ask me. And I have certainly, I'm certainly aware of studies about comparing digital to print, but I've never been specifically asked about the studies of Marvel with all its emphasis on superheroes that really are part of what adolescence is. Adolescence is trying on, I think it was Erickson who talked about the moratorium in which we try on different identities. Marvel is great, and thank God there are women heroes now. You know, I mean, I will jokingly tell you that I didn't know too much about Marvel for a while until I was asked to give a talk with Hugh Jackman, who I thought, no kidding, was, because I didn't know, was a wolf man. He of course it's Wolverine, but I didn't know that. So I'm on the stage and I'm saying, I think this is the first time that Wolf Man and Wolf Woman have come together. And the audience is, oh no. So I am not knowledgeable about Marvel, but I am appreciative. And truly, Hugh Jackman and quite a few of the quote unquote superheroes like him are working towards literacy. The reason why I was on this platform was because he was helping give a benefit for dyslexia. Superheroes. I think of Percy Jackson in The Lightning Thief, whether it's Marvel or books that give our young heroes working for the good. I think this is part of, our legacy going. I mean, just think of Greek mythology, and of course Percy Jackson is all these Percy Jackson books are about superheroes based on Greek myths. This is part of being a human. So even if I don't know those studies, I appreciate some aspects of them. If I am asked to be as critical analytic as I would like everyone to be, I would say there is a balance that one also has to have. I don't want all of anything to be the menu for our children. So I want to have them have the opportunity to broaden and go beyond it. So it's not to exclude, it's to take what is good about graphic novels or comics, especially for some of our struggling readers who otherwise are not necessarily going to read. We build bridges, but we who build the bridges have to be on the other side of the bridge giving more information. So we move from Marvel to extraordinary books about people who are heroes of a different sort and who are giving models in different ways. So it's a really interesting question that I've never been asked. I can't wait to tell my neighbor. He will die laughing that one of my questions from Bogota School of Readers is about Marvel. He is going to be so proud. He was almost embarrassed when he first told me that, he works on plots for Marvel. He has a whole new one too, so look forward.
Absolutely.
That's the most unusual question I've been asked. I want you to know that.
Thank you for saying that. It was very interesting thinking about that question. And finally, Dr. Wolf, as a closure, would you consider under this context we have been discussing with you today, would it be accurate to say that reading humanizes us?
Reading reaches to the very heart of humanity and tries to understand it and to express it. There's this wonderful, beautiful quote from Flaubert that I never say it quite correctly, but it's something to the effect that language is what we try to make on a beaten drum for bears to dance to, all the while we wish to make music that will melt the stars. That's what reading does. It gives us a chance to beat that drum and hope to melt the stars. So that's what I say about reading.
Doctora Wolf, muchas gracias. Nos ha hecho muy felices el día de hoy.
Dr.
Y sé
Wolf.
que a los que la vayan a escuchar pronto también los va a hacer muy felices. Qué bello poder reunirnos alrededor de la lectura, alrededor suyo, de sus palabras. Para nosotros es un gusto, un honor y una fiesta tenerla.
Dr. Wolf, you have made
Rose.
so happy today, and we are absolutely sure that for everybody who is going to able to be listening to this lecture, you're gonna make them very, very happy as well.
Good.
Para nosotros,
Para nosotros es
for us in the School of Readers,
un honor tenerla.
It's an honor to have you. It's a great honor to have you.
Y un espaldarazo muy grande para continuar con nuestra labor y con nuestra tarea ardua.
BibloRed.
20 años
dándole un giro a tu historia.